Connection with other people is the single most important thing for a human being. And the way that we connect with other people is through conversation.
Hey everyone, it's Rosie here. Welcome back to Radio Headspace. I'm really excited about today's conversation because we're talking about something that affects every single one of us: communication. It's not about what we say, it's how we say it. And to help us explore this, I'm joined by someone who spent years studying the science of how we connect. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and best-selling author, Charles Duhigg. Today we're talking about his latest book, Supercommunicators. It's all about what makes some people exceptional at conversations, how they listen, how they respond, and how they create real understanding. Hey, Charles, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I've been reading your book, and I'm almost at the end. And I have to say that I've listened to interviews that you've done, and I am a fan of Power of Habit, and I'm sure you hear this all the time. But I was so fascinated by everything that you talked about in the book. And I know that the thing that prompted you to write this was the communication or lack thereof you were having with your wife, right?
Yeah.
I'm curious for you, even after you've done this work and this research, what your communication is like with your partner now.
Well, it's a lot better now, right? And so the thing that you're referring to is that one of the reasons I wrote this book is that I got into this pattern with my wife. And I'm a journalist. I'm a professional communicator, theoretically. And my wife and I have been married for 20 years. And we got into this pattern where I would come home from work and I'd start complaining about my day. And my wife, Liz, would respond with this very good advice. She would say something like, why don't you take your boss out to lunch and you guys can get to know each other a little bit better. And instead of being able to hear what she was saying, I would get even more upset. And I would say, why aren't you supporting me? You're supposed to be on my side. You should be outraged on my behalf. Then she would get upset because I was attacking her for giving me good advice. And this happened again and again and again. And I'm sure this happens in your relationships, right? This is part of relationships. And so I went to these experts and I asked them, what's going on here? Why does this pattern keep emerging? And they said, well, actually, it's good that you called us because we're living through this golden age of understanding communication. We actually know for the first time what's actually happening inside your head as you're having this discussion. And they said, the thing that we've learned is that we make this fundamental mistake, which is that when we're having a discussion, we tend to assume that it's about one thing, right? We're talking about my day, or we're talking about where to go on vacation, or we're talking about our kids. But actually, every discussion is made up of multiple kinds of conversations. And those different kinds of conversations, they tend to fall into one of three buckets. There's these practical conversations where we're solving problems or we're making plans together. But then there's also emotional conversations where I tell you what I'm feeling. And I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize. I want you to show me that you support me. And then finally, there's social conversations, which is about how we relate to each other and to relate to others and the social identities that are important to us. And what they said is, look, if you're having different kinds of conversations at the same moment, it's really, really hard to hear each other. It's really hard to feel connected. And this gave rise to what's known as the matching principle in psychology, which says that at the core of successful communication is having the same kind of conversation at the same moment. And that if we're not doing that, then it's hard to converse. So obviously what was happening when I was coming home with my wife is I was having an emotional conversation and she was having a practical conversation and we couldn't hear each other. And now when I come home and I start complaining about my day, my wife will often say, look, do you want me to help you come up with a solution to this? Or do you just want to complain? And I say oh, look, this isn't that big a deal. I actually just want to complain. I just need to vent and get this off my chest. And as a result, we can get aligned with each other and the conversation goes much better.
Yeah, I love that. And if I'm hearing this correctly, I'm hearing that you and your wife were able to set parameters when having these types of conversations. You were able to have, these, I'll call them guardrails so that you can both be in alignment when you're having that communication. Is that right?
That's exactly right. That was very good. That was very good. What's known as looping for understanding, demonstrating that you're listening. You're exactly right. And And actually, they teach this in schools now. They teach teachers that when a student comes up and they're having something important that they want to talk about, the teacher should ask them as the first question, do you want to be helped? Do you want to be hugged? Or do you want to be heard? Which are the three kinds of conversations, right? The practical, the social, or the emotional and the social. Okay, so let me ask you a question. So are you married?
Yes.
Okay. How long have you and your husband been married?
We're not married. We've been together for 21 years, so okay. I'm sure we can have a whole podcast on that.
So a little bit of time, a little bit. I won't. Yeah. So let me ask, how has your communication with your husband or your significant other changed over time? Like, what have you learned about communicating with each other that makes it easier?
That's why super communicators resonated with me so much, because I feel like a lot of those skills and the way in which you're asking certain questions and being an active listener really has helped us become more aligned. I find that men in my life tend to like to fix things. They want to fix. And so I would notice whenever I'd come home and I'd have this problem, I'm having an issue with a friend or something's happening at work, and he starts trying to be like, why don't you just do this? Or why don't you just tell him this? Or why do you keep blah, blah, blah? And to me, it feels very like it's negating the emotion I'm having. And so I realize, right, I'm having an emotional experience, so I just want somebody to listen. And so I think that that's one of the things that I've learned after many years of failing, that's been one of the things that's been the most helpful.
Yeah, no, and it sounds like you were having an emotional conversation and your partner is responding with a practical conversation. And as a result, you're saying, look, we have different goals here. Like, I don't want you to solve my problem. I want you to comfort me. I want you to listen and empathize and just understand where I'm coming from. And this happens a lot. And in part, it happens because one of the things that we know about super communicators is that they tend to think more about communication, but just a little bit more, like not a lot more, just a little bit more than the average person. And we're all super communicators at one time or another, right? We all have the capacity to connect with other people. But what super communicators do is that oftentimes they recognize the skills that allow them to connect with the people who are closest to them. And they recognize that they can cross-apply those skills to nearly anyone. When you're coming home and you're talking to your partner, you're probably at some level thinking about, how do I communicate in addition to what do I want to communicate? Is that fair?
Yeah, that's totally fair. And that makes total sense. And what do we do in a situation where we're wanting to connect with somebody, we're wanting to communicate, but the other person doesn't want to?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So let's just say at the outset, not everything can be or has to be a conversation, right? Like when I'm talking to my kids and I say, I want to have a conversation with you about your rooms, I don't actually want to have a conversation with them about the rooms. I just want them to clean their rooms. Now, the goal here, though, is to give you the skills that when you want to have a conversation, you have the tools available to you in order to really connect with someone. But if they don't want to connect back, it's pretty hard to have that connection. There's a bunch of things that we can do to invite them to connect with us, to show them that we want to connect with them, to make it easier for them. But there's just some people who just don't want to connect, right? And so the first thing that we can do is we can just be respectful of whether someone wants to connect or not. Now, that being said, let's say it's someone who you really feel like you have to connect with. Let's say it's an uncle and you're at the dinner table and you're like, look, I can't spend Thanksgiving dinner with this guy, like, staring off into space. Or it's with your partner and you guys are upset with each other. The first and most important thing we can do is we can ask them a deep question. And a deep question is something that asks them about their values or their beliefs or their experiences, which can sound kind of intimidating, but it actually isn't. It's very easy to do. If you meet someone, for instance, who's like a doctor, instead of saying, where do you practice medicine? You can say, why'd you decide to go to medical school? Or what do you love about being a doctor? Those are very easy questions to ask. And what they do is they invite the other person to say something real and meaningful. They're showing that you want to connect with them, that you're curious about them. And up till that point, they might have been like, look, I'm not going to talk to this person. I just want to get through this party, this office party, and without small talk. But now that you've asked them a real question, you're inviting them to connect, and they might change their mind and want to converse with you. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Okay. Yeah, Charles, I have another follow-up to that. I guess why does small talk bother us so much?
Yeah. So tell me the last time you had small talk and you were like, this is boring. Like, I wish that we were talking about something else.
Yesterday.
Okay. So what happened?
I was speaking at an event for a magazine.
Okay.
And everybody's just standing around, and we're in the green room. There's a panel, people are getting switched on, they're getting mic'd up. It's like a kind of, a lot of components, a lot of moving parts. And, I'm standing around waiting for my time to go on stage, and, people are just kind of lolling about. And, somebody came up to me and we just started to chit chat, and I could just tell it was, like, what do you do? But nobody was paying attention. Does that make sense?
Because it's boring, right?
Yeah.
So small talk is not inherently bad. Like, it's bad to have a conversation that's boring to both people. But like, oftentimes I make small talk with my wife all the time. I'm like, what did you do today? Or I like go to a party and like, I like to talk about surfing because I surf. And I'm like, what breaks do you surf? And like, what kind of board do you ride? And to someone listening in, they might be like, this is the most boring small talk I've ever heard. But to me, it's kind of fascinating because I care about surfing and I like to talk to this person. So it's not that it's small talk we want to avoid. It's boredom that we want to avoid. And when we feel most bored is when it feels like we are doing something perfunctory that we don't care about, and neither does the other person, right? That feels really boring. It feels unengaging. But on the other hand, simply by asking that question a little bit differently, where do you live? Oh, I live in this neighborhood. Oh yeah, what do you like about that neighborhood? Like what, like, did you move there on purpose, or did your spouse make you move there? Like, does it have a good community? Like, what do you like about it? We're still talking about something that maybe it's not world peace, right? It's not Israel and Palestine, but it's not small talk. It's not boring because we're talking about what we care about in the world, how we see the world, what our values and our experiences are. That feels like something that's meaningful and interesting and that helps us connect.
Yeah. Do you find that type of communication is more helpful to our mental health? Like, do you think this will help improve our communication skills to lead to a better mental well-being?
Absolutely. I mean, we know from study after study, like the thing that can create mental ill health is isolation, right? We know this from study after study. The U.S. Surgeon General has said that being lonely is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. In fact, one of my favorite studies, and this is in the book, is about the Harvard study for adult development, right? So about 80 years ago, Harvard researchers start following around thousands and thousands of people, trying to figure out what makes them healthier at age 65, what makes them happier at age 65, what makes them more successful at age 65, defining success however they want to. And what they find is that the only thing that reliably predicts health, happiness, and success at age 65 is having at least a handful of close relationships at age 45. You could be rich. You could be the most successful lawyer on earth. You could be president of the United States. If you do not feel close to other people, then when you hit 65, your health is going to start declining, right? Even before 65. Your happiness is non-existent. If I ask you if you're successful, even if you're wealthy, you're going to say, no, I don't feel successful at all. Connection with other people is the single most important thing for a human being. And the way that we connect with other people is through conversation.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on the efficacy of communicating via text message or email or communicating in person or on a FaceTime or, via a different avenue, like a book. Is there a difference?
Yeah. So there's absolutely a difference. Let me ask, do you have kids?
I don't.
Okay. So I have a
I have
13-year-old. You have dogs? Very similar, but fewer thumbs, right, for texting. So I have a 13-year-old and a 16-year-old, both boys. So here's the thing that's really interesting is if you think about what communication is, and communication is our superpower. As Homo sapiens, communication is the superpower that has allowed us to succeed so well. If you think about what communication is, it's a lot of it has to do with how much information I can convey very quickly. So if we're face to face, that is the most information rich setting on earth. Not just because I can see you and I can see your hands, I can see your gestures, and I can see your expressions, I can smell you. So if we could have every conversation face to face, that would be wonderful. But we can't, right? That's not practical. Sometimes we need to call someone. Sometimes we need to Zoom with them. Sometimes it's just something fast and we just want to like send a text. So what happens in each of those forms of communication is there are strengths and weaknesses in how much information we can convey, and we need to be aware of those different strengths and weaknesses and the rules that they imply. A great example of this is telephones. 100 years ago, when telephones first became popular, there were all these articles that appeared saying people will never have a real conversation on a phone, right? Up till that point, all conversations had happened face to face, and people said, look, if you can't see the person, if you can't sit quietly with them for a second, if you can't see their gestures and their expressions, you're never going to have a real conversation. It's just not going to work. And what's interesting is at the time, they were exactly right. If you look at these transcripts of the early phone conversations, people use them like telegrams. They would call someone up and they'd say, here's my grocery list or here's my stock order. And then the other person would say, okay, and hang up the phone. They didn't know how to do this thing back and forth. Now, by the time you and I and everyone listening was in middle school, we could talk on the phone for like 7 hours a night, right? And it was the most meaningful conversations. And anyone who's listening who has teenagers, if you've eavesdropped on your kids' phones conversations, you know they are so boring, right? These were the most boring conversations on earth. And yet we thought that they felt so meaningful and important, and they were. So what changed? What changed is we grew up with phones and we learned the rules for using them. Without being aware of it, when you're on the telephone, you will over-enunciate your words by about 20%. You will put more emotion into your voice because you know that the person can't see you, so they can't see your expression. So you have to convey through your voice what you're feeling. We're not aware that we're doing this, but we just do it. That's why when you hear your like partner talk and then you hear him talk on the phone and you're like, why do you sound so fake on the phone? Like, why are you using that phone voice? It's because he knows the rules of phone. He knows those rules so well, he doesn't even think of them as rules. Our kids grew up with other forms of communication, and so it's very intuitive to them how to use emojis, how to text each other, what the rules are for email versus text versus Snapchat versus a voicemail. For those of us who didn't grow up with those technologies, we have to think about the rules a little bit more deliberately. But that doesn't mean that those aren't rich forms of communication. It just means that they're different forms of communication. And if you take a second to think about them, you can remember those rules. When I'm talking to you on the phone, I can say something sarcastic and I know you'll hear the sarcasm in my voice. But when I'm typing something to you in an email, if I don't remind myself, if I say this bit of sarcasm, you might take it seriously and you might get upset, then we miscommunicate. So the key here, the gain here, is just to let ourselves remember that different forms of communication have slightly different rules.
Wow. I'm so curious to hear you talk about the sort of the importance of vulnerability when communicating. Like, I'm a very deep person. I love having these types of conversations. You know, I can go deep with people. I can be in an Uber, a Lyft, and just decide, okay, I want to talk to this person. Like, how long have you been doing this? You know, and I do the line of questioning because I'm just curious, you know, and I find that I can really connect with people when they're in that vulnerable space. And I'm curious for you in the work that you've done with supercommunicators, like what role does that component of vulnerability, like what that plays in establishing that connection?
Oh, it's hugely important, right? What vulnerability is we feel vulnerable when we say something that someone else might judge. And what's important is at that moment, it's essentially kind of an offering to you. And it's an offering that you can accept or that you can reject. And the way that we accept it is we recognize that vulnerability and we reciprocate. That reciprocation shows that you are going to take care of my admission. You're going to take care of my showing you a little bit of my underbelly.
If you could give us some tips on how to communicate in an effective way with people in our lives that don't have the same views, what would be some key ways that we can, or what are some tools that we can use in order to communicate with the people?
It's a great question. And there's one really simple way, which is when you're talking to Uncle Jim at the Thanksgiving table, and Uncle Jim believes crazy things, right? Like he likes the other candidate. He thinks that lizard people are running the world. He thinks that, 9/11 was an inside job. Instead of saying, Uncle Jim, you're nuts, say to him, hey, I'm just wondering, what does this mean to you? Why is this important to you? Wait, whether I agree with you or not, I'm just really curious. I want to understand, you seem to feel passionately about this. What is it? What is this? Why is this important to you? And then just listen. And I promise you what Uncle Jim is going to say is something you can understand and agree with. He's going to say something like, look, the reason why I'm voting for Trump, or the reason why I'm voting for Biden, or the reason why I'm voting for, I believe that lizard people are taking over, is because I feel like if I'd been alive 30 years ago, that my life would be easier and that the elites have made it harder for me. I feel like it's unfair. It's unfair that I work this hard and that I still have to struggle. And we all have felt that, right? We've all felt excluded. We've all felt disrespected. We know how hard it is to work and work and work, and how unfair it feels to work so hard and not see any progress. That is something that we have in common. And once we can say, look, I hear you. Here's what I hear you saying. Tell me if I'm getting this right. I have felt the same way, and I don't agree with you about the lizard people. I don't agree with you about your candidate, but I do hear what you're saying, and I think it's legitimate, and I felt the same way myself. At that moment, we are connected with each other. And from that connection, a relationship, a conversation, a dialogue can flourish. Maybe about presidential candidates, maybe about something completely different. But we're finding things that feel meaningful to us both. And instead of spending that conversation trying to convince you, you're wrong, I'm right, your guy is a criminal, your guy is a doddering old person. Instead, what we're doing is we're saying, I want to understand you, and I want you to understand me. And that feels really meaningful.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. Okay, final question. If you could give one takeaway to readers, something they could gain from supercommunicators, particularly in the context of mental health, what is the one thing that you would hope that they take away from this book?
The thing I would most hope, build that relationship that's faltering. Your college roommate that you haven't talked to in 10 years, your aunt that you haven't really hung out with, that friend that you guys spent so much time together 6 months ago and you haven't really talked in a while. Just send them an email and say, hey, look, I'd love to catch up. Can we set aside, 20 minutes to talk on the phone next week? When you do that, you are going to not only feel better after that conversation, you are going to feel better in general. It's well worth that time and effort and energy.
Charles, thank you so much for coming onto the show.
Thank you for having me. This has been such a joy for me. I really appreciate it.